Hi everyone. My apologies for having to do the lecture this way today. I've just, as you can see, I'm quite sick. So I didn't want to infect any of you with whatever awful bug has laid me low. Nevertheless, I will attempt to explain some of what I think is important about these opening sections of Nagarjuna's work. And then we will spend some time on Thursday, assuming I'm better by that time, dealing with any questions that you might have about what I'm going to say today, and then we'll move on with Nagarjuna on Thursday. So the work that we're going to look at for the next 2 weeks, in fact 3 weeks if you count Shantideva, is going to mark a return to the verse format that we started off with when we read the Dhammapada. However, there's one thing to note, as I'm sure you were well aware when you were reading the text. The density of the verses is it can be a little intimidating. So for today, I just want to talk about some outline, some ways of thinking about Madhyamaka thought that will help you deal with this text and help you deal with the text and hopefully assist you in reading it carefully. So Nagarjuna, like many of the Buddhist philosophers that we've addressed and will address in the class, not much is known about his life. He was thought to be an educated Brahmin from a family in South India. He is thought to have worked sometime in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, so 150 to 250 or so. Most importantly for our thinking, Nagarjuna is probably, without question, the most widely influential Buddhist philosopher after the Buddha himself. He's been called by some the second Buddha. And he's the founder of the Madhyamaka school, or middle way school, which is one of 2 branches of Mahayana Buddhist philosophy. And I'll talk a little bit about Mahayana Buddhist philosophy in a moment. The other school is Yogacara, and we will look at the Yogacara school after we look at the Madhyamaka school in some detail. Now, there are a couple distinct features of the Madhyamaka approach to Buddhist philosophy that I want to draw your attention to. And the first of those features is this idea of the 2 truths. Recall that when we were talking about the 2 truths in the context of the Abhidharmika thought, that the idea is there is a conventional truth that pertains to composite wholes, and then there is an ultimate truth that pertains to dharmas, which are the substratum out of which all composite wholes are built. Now, Nagarjuna's understanding of the 2 truths doctrine is very different from the Abhidharma understanding of the 2 truths doctrine. The idea with Nagarjuna is that conventional truths are those truths that pertain to the mundane world, the world that is populated with composite wholes like persons and objects. While the ultimate truth is that all phenomena are devoid of what we might call self-being, intrinsic nature, or essence. So, unlike the ultimate truth in the Abhidharmic model, where the ultimate truth pertains to causal relations that obtain between fundamentally existing elements of the world, the ultimate truth for Madhyamaka is a negative claim. It's a negative claim about conventional reality, and is not thereby an articulation of a metaphysical ultimate. This will also, for Nagarjuna's commentator Chandrakirti, amount to the claim that even the claim that all phenomena are empty, that itself is empty. Now, this is a kind of, this leads directly to the second feature of Madhyamaka that I want to point your attention towards. And that is that there's a deep thread of skepticism running through this form of Buddhism. And to give you a little flavor of that, I'm just going to read a quote to you now from the top of the second page of your handout. And that quote says the following. It's from Chandrakirti's commentary on Nagarjuna's text that we're reading. And he says, "If one who holds that particular things do not have self-existence exposes the logical fault in the views that they have, how can there be a logical inconsequence in an argument which merely exposes logical inconsequence? Words are not like policemen on the prowl. We are not subject to their independence. On the contrary, their truth lies in their efficacy. They take their meaning from the intention of the one using them. It follows that we have merely invalidated our adversary's thesis. We need not accept the antithesis of the logical fault we have exposed. So the important point to note here in connection to Nagarjuna is that in the text you're about to read, he argues at length against many different ways of understanding core Buddhist claims. But those negative arguments are not yet a positive argument for a view of his own. And this is part of what Chandrakirti is here trying to point out, that it does not commit one who has used the concepts of his opponent to refute his opponent's view, that person has thereby committed themselves to the opposing view of their opponent. And so, unlike his Abhidharmika opponents, Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka eschews any metaphysical speculation about the ultimate nature of things. Any such theoretical pretensions are bound to lead the mind towards attachment and distortion. So, recall a few classes ago, when we were talking about the not self-teaching, there's this idea that there's this sense of being an I. And then we break that down into 5 aggregates. And then once the Abhidharmikas come along, they reorganize those 5 aggregates into 4 fundamental existence, Paramatta Satyas, Rupa, Chitta, Chetasika, and Nibbana. Now, Nagarjuna's view is different from the Buddhists that we have seen thus far, because in addition to composite wholes like persons not being ultimately real, he doesn't think anything is ultimately real. So his main target here is going to be Abhidharmic thinkers like Vasubandhu, who believe that there are momentary mental and physical events that make up the basic tapestry of the world and are the basis upon which conceptual construction creates a world of composite wholes. Nagarjuna will reject this view and claim, on the contrary, that even dharmas lack intrinsic nature. They don't have anything that individuates them from their own side. They are dependent on other things for their existence. One of the things that Nagarjuna likes to do when he's arguing is he'll use something called the Chatsakoti, the logical tetralemma. And this is a feature of Indian logic where there are actually 4 positions in logical space rather than just 2. Most of us, when we think about logical space, you think there's either a truth value T or a truth value F. Whereas for Nagarjuna, there are 4 positions, which I have on your handout as A, B, A and B, and neither A or B. And the point of this is to exhaustively analyze the logical space of any given concept. And Nagarjuna will often use this structure to provide negative arguments against the coherence of any one position. Now, before getting into the heart of Nagarjuna's actual arguments, I want to give you some context for understanding the philosophical milieu in which he's operating. And that's the philosophical milieu of Mahayana Buddhism. Now, Mahayana Buddhism means the great vehicle. And it's often contrasted with what's sometimes pejoratively called the Hinayana, or lesser vehicle. And the text that we've looked at from the Abhidharma, both Vasubandhu's Abhidharma as well as the Theravadan Pali Abhidharma and the Pali discourses, those would all be lesser vehicle teachings. It's very uncommon for this term to be used now, but there was a lot of polemics at the time, and a lot of Mahayana Buddhist philosophers were very disparaging towards those they thought were adherents of the lesser vehicle. Now, at this time, Nagarjuna was responding and commentating on a set of literature that I haven't had you read for this class, but I've given you one text from this tradition called the Prajna Paramita literature. Prajna means wisdom in Sanskrit, Paramita is perfection, so it's the perfection of wisdom. And here, this text, the Heart Sutra, is just a very important sutra for the Prajna Paramita tradition. And the Madhyamaka Buddhists took these texts as their foundation and were, very much concerned to be with responding to these texts. So I'd like to read this text to you now very carefully, and just to give you a flavor of what the different ways that these ideas are being expressed. Because in this text we see a very different approach to Buddhist philosophy than what we've been encountering so far, and I think that contrast is fruitful for understanding Nagarjuna's motivations. So here it goes. The noble Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, while practicing the deep practice of Prajna Paramita, looked upon the 5 skandhas, and seeing that they were empty of self-existence, said, "Here, Shariputra, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not separate from form, and form is not separate from emptiness. Whatever is form is emptiness, whatever is emptiness is form. The same holds for sensation and perception, formations and consciousness. Here, Shariputra, all dharmas are defined by emptiness, not birth or destruction, purity or defilement, completeness or deficiency. Therefore, Shariputra, in emptiness there is no form, no sensation, no perception, no formations, and no consciousness. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no shape, no sound, no smell, no taste, no feeling, and no thought. No element of perception from eye to conceptual consciousness, no causal link from ignorance to old age and death, and no end of causal link from ignorance to old age and death. No suffering, no source, no relief, no path, no knowledge, no attainment, and no non-attainment. Therefore, Sariputra, without attainment, bodhisattvas take refuge in Prajna Paramita, and live without walls of the mind. Without walls of the mind, and thus without fears, they see through delusions, and finally nirvana. All Buddhas, past, present, and future, also take refuge in Prajna Paramita, and realize unexcelled, perfect enlightenment. You should therefore know the great mantra of Prajna Paramita, the mantra of great magic, of the unexcelled mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, which heals all suffering and is true, not false. The mantra in Prajna Paramita spoken thus: Gatte gatte paragatte parasangate bodhi svaha. So the mantra there at the end, gatte gatte, gone, 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 gone beyond, gone totally beyond, awakening, and svaha kind of means like a relief. So we could probably spend a couple weeks just unpacking this terse little text. But given our time constraints, I just want to focus on a couple of points. The first is this concept of emptiness, which is going to really preoccupy us for the next couple of weeks, because it is an absolutely central concept for all Madhyamaka thought. And the idea of emptiness is that phenomena, in this text that we just looked at very briefly, the 5 aggregates, they're being empty means they lack something. It means that they're not. It's not a positive property that they have. It's something they lack. And we're going to talk in more detail about what that is in a few minutes. But to sort of get your philosophical imagination primed in that direction. What they lack is an essence, a thing that makes them what they are just by being what they are. Now, from the Mahayana Buddhist point of view, there are two other points of contrast that I want to draw out from this text to give you a bit of a flavor for the differences between the Mahayana Buddhist orientation as compared to the Abhidharmic and Theravada Buddhism that we've been looking at so far. So the first is this idea of the Bodhisattvas and the Arhants. So an Arhat is someone who becomes fully liberated from the cycle of samsara by practicing the path of the Buddha. And so in order for someone to become an Arhat, the teachings of the Buddha have to be available. A Bodhisattva is someone who vows to become a Buddha. So a Buddha is someone who arises in a period of time where there's no Dharma being taught and then rediscovers the path to liberation by their own effort. So the difference between a Buddha and an Arhat is that the Arhat has the benefit of being instructed by the Buddha's dispensation, whereas the Bodhisattva who becomes the Buddha must have a much longer career of rebirth before they're able to become Buddha. In the Mahayana philosophy, the Bodhisattva becomes a much more central figure. This figure exists in the Pali Canon that we looked at. The Buddha often refers to himself as an unenlightened Bodhisattva. But in Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva becomes something more central. And one of the more idiosyncratic and interesting features of the Mahayanic Bodhisattva is that a Bodhisattva takes a vow to not attain liberation until all beings have been emancipated. So the idea here is that one commits themselves to the round of rebirth until such a time as all beings have been liberated from misery. Now, we might well ask if that's even possible, but this again, I think, underscores a certain shift in emphasis away from this idea of liberation being an utterly transcendent, blank state that is achieved by escaping the world. And instead, in these texts, and certainly in Nagarjuna, we're going to see that the conceptual connection between nirvana as the end of dukkha and samsara as the round of rebirth is much closer than we had thought, or at least much closer than has been conceptualized by the authors of the text that we've already looked at. So that's something to keep in mind. In Madhyamaka Buddhism, the final goal of nirvana is not usually conceptualized as a kind of raw transcendence, but more of as an immanence that needs to be realized. So with those preliminaries in place, what I'd like to do now is just walk you through a little bit the dedicatory verse, which has a lot of really key concepts that really play a central explanatory role in Nagarjuna's analysis of the problem of suffering. And so we'll go through these in some detail, and then we'll see where that leaves us. So here's how the text begins. At the outset it says, this is Nagarjuna saluting the Buddha. He says, "I salute the fully enlightened one, the best of orators who taught the doctrine of dependent origination, according to which there is neither cessation nor origination, neither annihilation nor the eternal, neither singularity nor plurality, neither coming to be nor the going of any dharma for the purpose of nirvana, characterized by the auspicious cessation of hypostatization," prapancha. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this verse, clearly. But this verse is the frame by which all that follows in the text should be understood. And it's as it should be coming clear to you, I think, even just from reading this short little verse, this text and the texts that follow it really does represent a very different idea of how the notion of dependent origination works. And it's an intriguing one. So it's something that we'll want to think about very carefully. So in this verse that we just read, what we see is that the claim that what it is for phenomena to be dependently originated, how we define dependent origination, is to negate the possibility of characterizing phenomena as being ultimately a number of things. So it's to negate the possibility of phenomena being ultimately originating or ceasing, that is, arising or passing away. Of the 8 negations that we're about to go through, pardon me, this is the trickiest one to understand from a Buddhist point of view, precisely because in the text that we've already looked at, there's such a strong emphasis on the arising and passing away of phenomena. And therefore, to claim that what it is for something to be dependently originated seems very strange, because when we looked at our understanding of dependent origination from before, it looks like what it is for something to be dependently originated is just for it to arise and pass away in dependence on causes and conditions. And now we're seeing the definition of dependent origination predicated on a denial of that very assertion, which is very puzzling. And so it's going to take us a little time to unpack this claim over the next couple of weeks. But if you're patient, I think we'll be able to get to a place where we're reckoning with this idea with a bit more precision than we might be able to at the outset. So just be patient with this. Things cannot be ultimately characterized as being annihilated or eternal. This is something that we should basically be used to by now. The Buddhist denial of the extremes of annihilationism and eternalism is fairly standard at this point. So that not much of a surprise here. This is an interesting one, the singular or plural, one or many. There are a few places, and I'm not sure, I don't believe we read the text on this particular part of the teaching, but there is a few places where the Buddha tries to explain the continuity of mental processes across lifetimes. And in doing so, basically says that you're not identical with your previous life, but you're not different from it either. You're neither one nor many. And so this is an idea that continuity across time is not a single thing, and it's not multiple either, which is why phenomena which are dependently originated can't be accurately characterized as being ultimately singular or plural. And finally, coming or going, arriving or departing. Now, this claim ultimately amounts to the view that nothing ever really moves. This is because if what there are momentary events that arise and pass away instantaneously, like the dharmas, nothing actually changes or transforms. There's just a different set of aggregates at any given moment that arises and passes away. Nothing ever actually changes. It just arises and passes away and something replaces it. Now, Nagarjuna's denial of these two possibilities will be quite different from that of his Abhidharmic counterpoints, as we'll see. So, already in the dedicatory verse we see this very strange set of claims which actually seems to deny certain core features of the Buddhist philosophical program. And so getting clear about how Nagarjuna is understanding these ideas will be very important for us to evaluate his view. Now, part of the way into Nagarjuna's thinking is to recognize his target. Nagarjuna is very concerned with a certain cognitive phenomena, which we call prapancha. What this what this term means is conceptual proliferation. In the context of the Brahmajala Sutta that we read a couple of weeks ago, we can understand this notion in terms of the propensity of the mind to take up with speculative views. But I think, pardon me, but on an even more primal level, the idea here is that our capacity for discursive thought leads to the reification of the content of experience, leads to a kind of static attitude where we cling to the content of experience as if it's absolute. And when we take any of these dualities listed above in the dedicatory verse, when we take any of them as ultimately real, the mind will latch onto them, and then what it will do is it will reify the relata, the things that are related to each other in the network, and that will cause us misery, because to cling on to anything is an error for the Buddhist philosophers. So for Nagarjuna, by understanding that none of these ways of characterizing phenomena is ultimately true, we can come to recognize that all phenomena are empty, sunya, of svabhava. Svabhava is the Sanskrit word for, it literally means own being, sva, own, bhava, being. There are different ways that the term has been defined. Substance, essence, intrinsic nature. The concept is meant to denote any property a particular might have that makes it the particular it is. And what Nagarjuna is denying when he claims that phenomena are empty of svabhava is that any particular has a nature which makes it what it is just in and of itself. And so that's his reading of dependent origination, that what it is for something to be what it is for it to depend on other things. And therefore no particular can have a svabhava. Now, when you start to recognize that things are empty, this will help facilitate the relinquishing of one's attachment to even those conceptual schemes employed by the Buddha to try and explain the path to liberation, which is why in the text we see Nagarjuna examining some of the key doctrines of Buddhist philosophy in this unorthodox way. So let's consider an objection now. So here we go. This reading of dependent origination contradicts the Buddha's claim that dependent origination is an explanation of how things ultimately are. It explains the actual causal relations that obtain between ultimately real phenomena. In response to this objection, that this novel reading of dependent origination contradicts the Buddha's claim that dependent origination is to be understood in terms of the actual arising and passing away of ultimately real things, Chandrakirti quotes the following verse from the Pali Canon. Form is like a lump of foam, feeling like a water bubble, apperception is like a mirage, formations like a plantain trunk, and consciousness like an illusion. So I think it's important to note that even though Nagarjuna's arguments in the text that will follow are somewhat unorthodox compared to the stuff that we've been looking at so far, the texts, the philosophical systems that get built on the primary, that get built up on the canonical texts, all represent a certain kind of emphasis. Whenever you systematize something that isn't already systematic, you're gonna home in on certain key features, and you're gonna focus on those. And Nagarjuna is no different than Vasubandhu in this regard. He just picks different things to focus on. And as a result, the view that he comes up with is much different than the one that Vasubandhu comes up with. So, I think what we need to do now is talk a little bit more about what svabhava actually means, because that is going to be the central concept for us moving forward. So, in virtue of what should we understand the ephemeral nature of phenomena? In virtue of their being empty of any kind of essence. So emptiness, or shunyata, Something is said to be empty in virtue of its lacking any feature which defines, individuates, or constitutes the thing as the thing it is, separate or independent from any relations that that thing might be in with other things. Svabhava, as I mentioned earlier, literally means own being or self or inherent nature. More philosophically, it can mean essence, intrinsic property, substantial nature. Getting precise about the nature of this term is difficult because it's used in different ways. So there are at least 3 dimensions of Svabhava that we need to think about. The first is ontological. The ontological dimension of Svabhava is that what it is for something to exist is for it to be dependent on something else. Therefore, nothing exists independently. There are 3 ways we might understand the ontological dimension of Svabhava: as an essence, as a substance, and as absolute reality. So from the essence point of view, properties had by phenomena that make it the case that the phenomena can be known as the kind of phenomena they are. The hotness of fire, the wetness of water. Nagarjuna is okay with this stuff. He can acknowledge that heat is a really good reliable guide to fire, that what makes water is at least that it's wet. The second one of these is the one that he's really after, substance. The idea is that of substance svabhava is that the fundamental constituents of reality, dravyasat, that make up the basic furniture of the world and upon which all composite wholes are constructed through human interpretation. For example, the fundamental dharmas of the Abhidharmika scholastics. This is the thing that Nagarjuna is really focusing on in his attacks, the substance reading of the ontological dimension of Svabhava. So when you're reading the text and he starts to make these really wild claims about nothing really existing, make sure you realize that the denial of existence that he's attributing to some phenomena is Svabhava as a substance. And when he says that something doesn't exist, it means it doesn't ultimately exist because it doesn't have this. It doesn't have a Svabhava substance. And then the third dimension of the ontological dimension of Svabhava is that the true nature of reality, that all phenomena are empty of Svabhava in the sense of the second one I mentioned. Now, there are 2 other dimensions that are important as well. The second is cognitive. So our thoughts are structured in such a way that we impute Svabhava to the objects of our thought in a deeply habitual way. We must overcome this. This dimension of Svabhava explains the concept's soteriological utility. So it's not just about theory, it's about how we think about the world and the deep habit of turning the world into a discrete network of subjects and objects. And how our deep habitual disposition to do this actually causes us a lot of trouble. And so Svabhava has this cognitive dimension because it penetrates and organizes the way we think about the world. And this is part of what we have to overcome in developing the path. And finally, the semantic dimension of Svabhava. The meaning of words depend on their relation to other words. Thus, there is no position or view that can ultimately be asserted as the one true view. Okay, so I want to just mention one more contrast, just to summarize what we've done so far, and to make it clear where we're going to be headed. So, in the previous text we've looked at, when we've been doing decompositional, analytical, deconstructive analysis, it's mostly been concerned with persons. Right? Oh, you think there's a self, but really there's only 5 aggregates. Oh, you think there's a self, but really there's just these dharmas momentarily arising and passing away. For Nagarjuna, everything lacks Svabhava. Of course, human beings are empty of Svabhava, but so are all the things in the world. Nothing exists independently. And so the view that Nagarjuna is working with is much more radical than his forebears, because he's claiming that all phenomena are empty of svabhava. And that claim will have a massive impact on how people like Nagarjuna and his philosophical forebears interpret the texts, the teachings. So, when you're reading the text for next class, keep in mind Nagarjuna's proper target, that there is this idea of the svabhava as a substance. That's his main target. And if there are any questions between now and then, don't hesitate to email me. And again, I apologize for having to deliver the lecture today via video. I'll do my best to keep resting up so that come Thursday I'll be able to take the class without any difficulties. And we'll spend the first little while of the class on Thursday fielding questions about this, and we'll go from there. Okay, see you on Thursday.